So it was a very, very stormy night, and a businessman boarded a plane and took a middle seat between a middle-aged woman who was sitting at the window and a little girl who was sitting on the aisle seat. After the flight took off, the man began a conversation with the little girl who was about the age of his daughter. He found it strange that such a young girl would be traveling alone, but he kept those thoughts to himself. About an hour into the flight, the plane was suddenly jolted by extreme turbulence. The pilot came on the PA system and told everyone to fasten their seatbelts, that they were running into rough weather, and that there would be problems ahead. And several times during that next half hour, the plane made drastic dips and turns, shaking sometimes so that everything in the plane shook. Some people began crying, they were so worried. And many, like the woman sitting by the window, began praying intently. The businessman himself was sweating and clenching his seat as tightly as he could. Each drop made him hold a little bit stronger onto his seat. Meanwhile, the little girl next to him in that aisle seat sat quietly with her hands resting calmly on her legs. Incredibly, she didn't seem worried at all. Suddenly, the turbulence ended. The pilot came back onto the intercom system to apologize for the bumpy ride and announced that thankfully they would be landing soon. As the plane began its descent to the airport, the man said to the little girl, "You're just a little girl. But I've never met a braver person in all my life. Tell me, my dear, how is it that you remained so calm while all of us adults were so afraid?" Looking him innocently in the eyes, she said, "My father is the pilot, and he's taking me home." Trust. Trust. It's difficult. From the prophet Micah, chapter 5, verses 1 to 4. "But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, least among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient times. Therefore the Lord will give them up until the time when she who is to give birth has born. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the children of Israel. He shall take his place as shepherd by the strength of the Lord, by the majestic name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell securely. For now his greatness shall reach to the ends of the earth. He shall be peace." Trust. It's what Micah is advising the Israelites to do in the reading. Trust. They are seeking help, yearning for peace, and probably greatly discouraged. You see, because Micah was preaching a message of hope in the 8th century before the birth of Christ. We may not think much of it. We may not know much about that time. But for the people of Israel, it was a time when the world seemed to be falling apart. They had just been delivered from slavery in Egypt and led into the promised land. But now they were facing the destruction of Jerusalem and Samaria. Indeed, as we know later on, they were about to be deported from their land and go off to exile in Babylon. Everything they held near and dear was about to crumble and vanish. And in those darkest of days, Micah gets up and proclaims that the deliverance of God would come. and that it would come from the least likely source, the smallest of the clans of Judah, from humble Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a backwater town. Nobody paid attention to Bethlehem. You could see salvation coming from Egypt, salvation coming from Jerusalem, but Bethlehem? From this humble clan, Micah predicts, would arise a leader who would deliver an oppressed people back to their homeland, Israel. A leader who would not only restore the plundered and the profaned temple in Jerusalem, but also a leader who would bring that peace and that wholeness for which those people longed and for which the human spirit has longed for centuries. How in the world would this be possible? All was lined up against them. For those who were realistic, this could not happen. And in fact, it did not happen immediately, but it did happen. Israel was restored. Trust in God proved to be the right move. Listen to the words of St. Luke in the Gospel as Elizabeth and Mary meet one another. During those days, Mary set out and traveled to the hill country in haste to a town of Judah, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greetings, the infant leapt in her womb. And Elizabeth, filled with the Holy Spirit, cried out in a loud voice and said, "Most blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And how does this happen to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For at the moment your greeting reached my ears, the infant in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed are you who believe that what was spoken to you by the Lord would be fulfilled." Once again, we have an impossible situation happening to people who in their day were nothing. Actually, two impossible situations. Elizabeth is old and frail. Old and frail. And she's now 6 months pregnant. And Mary, a virgin, is expecting her first child. Any realistic person would say, this is impossible. This can't happen. Yet Mary trusts the angel's words to her. When she hears of Elizabeth's pregnancy, she travels to the hill country of Judea to greet Elizabeth and to congratulate her, to see it with her own eyes, what the angel told her. Together, they have to share the good news for each of them. Remember, Elizabeth and Zechariah had been hoping for a child for years and years and years. They had probably given up. Mary is engaged to Joseph and certainly did not expect a child before their marriage. But when confronted with news from God by the message of an angel, both women trust. The impossible becomes possible with trust in God. And we might say, well, that's all good and fine for the 8th century before Christ, or that's fine for the 1st century AD when the angels are appearing, but it's difficult to trust God in the 21st century. Nations are at war. Russia continues to bombard Ukraine. Inflation is running away in our culture and our country. The climate seems to be getting warmer and storms seem to be getting worse. More and more people are turning away from God and the church to seek their own pleasure and their own success in the secular world. Whereas more than 75% of Catholics went to church every week in the 1950s and the 1960s, statistics say approximately 39% now come to Mass weekly. We would rather trust in ourselves rather than in God, unless we are wise. The wise still seek him. The prophet Micah's words to us are equally appropriate 29 centuries later, because they encourage us to listen to the Lord, not the voices of the world, to listen to the Lord, to seek him, and to trust him. Because believe it or not, as much as we think we're so sophisticated and we are special in our own time, the situation of the world was as dire as Micah foresees the time of peace and joy. We are not ready to be exiled, thank God. We're not ready to see all of this destroyed, literally torn down, thank God. And so for those people who were expecting that, to envision a time of peace and joy was absolutely impractical, impossible. But this is what Christmas time is supposed to do for us these days. No matter the darkness, no matter the problems, no matter whatever's confronting us, it's supposed to give us a glimpse of peace and joy. All may not be perfect. All probably will not be perfect. COVID and the flu and RSV all seem to be getting worse day by day. Every time we think we've gotten through it, something else pops up on the news. And we know when they're gone, something else is going to come around. Yet if we trust in God, if we seek God, we are promised all will be well. You may have seen the bumper sticker on cars, "God is my co-pilot." Well, today I think it might be more realistically to say, God is our pilot. We, like the little girl in a storm-tossed plane, need to trust the pilot. We, like the two women in the gospel, Elizabeth and Mary, need to put our trust in God. You know, there are at least two types of people in the world: those who believe this and those who do not. And we have wonderful stories around Christmas time to kind of give us examples of these kinds of characters. I think Charles Dickens captured it best in A Christmas Carol, when he presents the characters Fezziwig and Scrooge. Fezziwig is a real person from Scrooge's past, and he's always pictured as plump and smiling and kind of a flushed cheeks and affable. He's generous. He's always smiling and kind. Fezziwig was known for throwing great Christmas parties. We all know people like this in our life, I think. For his friends, his family, even all of his employees. His generosity knows no bounds, and he has as much fun being with the people as the people do coming to their parties. He lives in the same world as Scrooge, the same world, but he lives with Christian hope. Scrooge, on the other hand, is always depicted as skinny and bony and mean-looking and, of course, miserable, because Scrooge was always afraid of never having enough. Every day for Scrooge could be described with one word: almost. There was never enough money. There was never enough time to make more money. There was never enough heat. There was never enough love. Scrooge sees the world as dark and dim, unfulfilled, waiting to get you, cold and loveless. And so, this Advent, are we a Scrooge or a Fezziwig? When people leave us, do they leave with a song in their heart? Do they walk a little lighter? Do they feel like they've been around light? Or do they say, well, I've done my duty. Thank God I don't have to see her for another month. Thank goodness he won't be around for the next 6 weeks. Are we Fezziwig or are we Scrooge? No matter what happens, do we seem to find fault, to never have enough? Nothing is ever right. Or do we see every day as a new opportunity? I had a wonderful, wonderful upbringing, and we had great neighbors. And around the corner from us were a man and woman named Leo and Teresa Flynn. He was a commercial artist, a very free spirit, very talented, and she was very practical. And together they made a great couple. And I remembered that when she died, her youngest daughter, we were best friends growing up, did a eulogy right before Mass began. And she described them this way at the end. She said, "My mother was very practical. She got us to school. She got everything taken care of. She managed the finances. And my father dreamed. He bought a house in Fells Point that was falling down and said, 'Just think, Tess, we could fix this up and I can take all these antiques. Look at these antiques.' She said they were destroyed chairs and old sofas with stuffing coming out of them. 'These antiques can become precious treasures.' And she said, so every day my mother would get up and my father would get up and my father would say, 'Just think, Tess, of the possibilities.' And she would say, 'Yeah, Leo, it's one damn thing after another.'" Are we Teresa or are we Leo? Do we see the possibilities every day like Fezziwig? Or do we see simply the cold, the darkness, the bad news like Scrooge? If we truly seek the Lord, we will discover that we have all that we need already. Bishop Barron is famous for saying that. It becomes one of his mantras. Remember, you already have all that you need. And isn't it true when we look around the world? I already have all that I need. My sister is famous for asking us for Christmas lists. And usually she does it on Thanksgiving. So after we have our Thanksgiving meal, she'll say, "Okay, so what do you want for Christmas?" This year she started before Halloween. And usually at Thanksgiving I say, "Well, I haven't even thought about this yet. I don't even know." And she's like, "I've got to get things. You've got to tell me what you want." Well, first of all, I don't need anything. There are things that I want, but don't need anything. But this year before Halloween she began, and I said, "This is unbelievable. I haven't even begun thinking about Thanksgiving yet. And well, I need those lists because I'm ordering online and there's a supply shortage and there's all kinds of interruptions that might happen." I'm like, oh my gosh. We already have all that we need. We don't need anything. We may want, we may desire, but we don't need anything, especially if we are seeking God, because God has already provided for the day, and God already knows what He's providing for tomorrow. And God already knows what He's providing for Christmas. He's given us the best gift in the world in Jesus. And if we are wise, we will still seek Him.